Sorry again, the previous session, I think, cut out just a few minutes early. Like we said, the folks from GCF are presenting from Africa in different parts where the internet connection is not as stable in some areas. So appreciate everyone bearing with us in this virtual quarantine world.
Awesome. Again, this is Dr. Michael Brown. Thank you so much for being here today. There might be an interpretive dance at the end of this Q&A. You got to stay tuned and see what happens. Dr. Michael Brown is a conservation ecologist and a joint conservation science fellow with the Giraffe Conservation Foundation and the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. Small titles. Having worked for the last decade on wildlife conservation issues in Africa, Michael brings a passion for conservation and a wealth of experience in both field research and applied quantitative ecology. Through his collaborative efforts with local and international partners, he works to develop intimate understandings of ecosystems that giraffe inhabit and use his understanding to design and execute effective conservation actions. In this talk, he'll be exploring some of the many ways GCF use cutting-edge science to design, execute, and monitor ambitious, forward-thinking conservation action. Very excited.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me see if I can share this screen real quick. And we are off. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Luciana, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in here. It's so great to have so many people interested in giraffe and giraffe conservation. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak about some of the work we're doing today. Really excited. So we're back at it now. Thanks, guys, for your patience. But over the past 3 presentations, you guys have seen some great work to conserve giraffe across Africa. Now, at its core, the Giraffe Conservation Foundation is a science-based organization. And as such, we are committed to using the best available data to design, execute, monitor, and promote giraffe conservation initiatives. Effective conservation strategies are built on foundations of solid data. And we work to employ cutting-edge science to inform these strategies. For me personally, by training, I'm a conservation ecologist. So I like to think a lot about trying to understand the relationships among living things in these complicated ecosystems, and then figure out a way to identify opportunities to use these understandings with local partners to thoughtfully promote a way for people and giraffe to coexist. And throughout this process, I have become enamored with giraffe, like many of you, no doubt. Next slide. But as it turns out, fascination with giraffe is certainly not a new human phenomenon. Humans have been sharing space with giraffe since before humans were actually humans. Giraffe, as we currently know them, appeared in Africa, as Steph said, between 1 and 2 million years ago, whereas Homo sapiens are relative newcomers, arising roughly 200,000 years ago. But in these hundreds of thousands of years of shared existence, we've long admired giraffe. We've studied their natural history through tracking and captured their unique anatomy through ancient rock art like this carving in Tweefontein, Namibia. We have admired their ecology and the role that they played in the same ecosystems that nurtured us as a species. But despite this long relationship with this iconic animal, there is still so much we have to learn. And indeed, the need for this knowledge is becoming increasingly more urgent. Next slide, please. Throughout the giraffe's range, landscapes are changing at an unprecedented rate. As Steph, Arthur, and Julian all mentioned, giraffe are facing increasing challenges of urbanization, road, railway, fence development, encroachment with livestock, and illegal hunting. Next slide. But to ensure a sustainable future for these animals and to figure out a better way to coexist with them, we need to develop strategic understandings of giraffe ecology at scales unattainable by our ancestors. By harnessing the latest technology with the most cutting-edge scientific methods and combining them with the intimate understandings that can only be developed through boots-on-the-ground field ecology and local partnerships, GCF is pushing the boundaries of data-driven conservation action. Next slide. But understanding the complicated processes of nature is no easy job. Different processes play out over different time scales and different spatial scales. So trying to develop this nuanced understanding of how giraffe interact with their environment is similar in some ways to appreciating a pointillist piece of art like this one here. To understand the processes leading to the product, to understand the parts that contribute to the whole, next slide, you need, next slide, to look at it, next slide, from multiple perspectives. So next slide here. And similarly, to get an appreciation for giraffe ecology and conservation, we need to study multiple ecological processes on multiple ecological scales. Next slide. Next one. So we can look at the super small scale and ask questions about what an individual giraffe eats, for instance, or we can ask how a giraffe moves around its landscapes. These particular processes play out over the span of a day to a week to a season, and they largely focus on how individual giraffes interact with their environment. Next one. We can also look at how a population grows or changes its distribution over time. In conservation, the metrics we are often interested in are maximizing population growth or stability. All the work we do really is to serve that goal of enhancing population viability. But this is an inherently tricky thing to try to measure. These particular processes play out over years and decades, and as such, they require dedicated methods and commitment to effectively monitor. Next slide. It's also important to zoom out even further to identify comparative population trends, threats, and conservation opportunities at a global scale. How are different giraffe doing in different countries and different regions? This approach allows us to think big and figure out how we can maximize our impact for all giraffe. Next slide. So in the remainder of this presentation, we'll be exploring all of these scales. But before we delve into these techniques, I want to make sure you appreciate the diversity of landscapes that giraffe currently inhabit. As we've discussed before, giraffe can be found in over 20 different countries across a huge swath of sub-Saharan Africa. This range encompasses diverse habitat types, governments, policies, and cultural practices. Next slide. We can see some of the diversity of these giraffe habitats through these next couple pictures. From the arid scrub of the Kanene region in Uganda, next slide, to the rugged savannas of northeastern Uganda, next slide. From the barren pans of Etosha National Park, next one, to the acacia woodlands of Murchison Falls National Park, next. Giraffe live in diverse landscapes, each with unique challenges and unique conservation opportunities. So there is no one conservation silver bullet. There's no one size fits all solution. But the key is in identifying ecological touch points and principles that can inform and evaluate local efforts and then share these lessons learned across multiple locations. Next. So we work really hard to help achieve these ambitious scientific and conservation goals. And as an organization, we can do a lot. But as we've discussed before, the real power in these efforts, next slide, is in the collaborative nature of our work. We work with a wide range of partners in academia, in NGOs, with local governments, and in zoos and other research institutions, to make sure that we have the appropriate scientific capacity and local engagement to do the right job. Next slide. And we also work very closely with dedicated rangers, scientists, communities, administrators, all of them working hard in the protected areas and communities where giraffe live. Their contributions to giraffe conservation are immense. the scales of giraffe ecology that I discussed before and explain how they all fit together to inform conservation action. So we'll start with one of the smaller scales, foraging ecology. What do giraffes eat, and why do they eat the things they eat? So behaviorally, giraffes spend most of their days eating and resting. So it stands to reason that you can't truly understand giraffe without understanding the plants they consume. Food is one of the most critical resources for sustaining viable giraffe populations in the wild. So we work to understand what giraffes eat and why they eat them. Next slide. So click on it again. This one's a quick video. Perfect. They use their 20-inch tongues and dexterous lips to forage of their African habitats. They spend most of their days stripping up to 75 pounds of leaves, seeds, flowers, and bark from woody vegetation. Like cows or goats, giraffe are ruminants with multi-chambered stomachs and specialized gut microbiomes that allow them to digest plants. Next slide. But it turns out the decisions of what to eat are pretty complicated out on the savannah. There are lots of different plants to choose from. Some have really nasty thorns. Some of them are toxic. Some of them have real big juicy leaves. Some of them have real small waxy leaves. And they all have different nutritional properties. So how do we figure out how the giraffe make these decisions what to eat? Well, the techniques can range from the really low tech but labor intensive, so following a giraffe around in a Land Cruiser and identifying every plant they eat and counting every bite of every plant they eat. Or we can take a really high-tech approach, like taking their droppings to a laboratory and looking at the DNA of the different plant particles in droppings to identify the actual species and the diet composition. We can then do nutritional analyses on the plant items themselves to figure out the molecular components that make them so appetizing to giraffe. So what are we finding here? Time and time again, we see the importance of diverse plant communities for sustaining giraffe. Like you or I, giraffe need a balanced diet, and they need lots of choices to achieve that balance. In the different ecosystems across Africa, giraffe have been identified eating dozens of different plant species. But generally, regardless of where they are, they typically have 5 to 10 plant species that are their favorites. So as we look to preserve giraffe habitats, ensuring that there's enough quantity of a diverse range of high quality woody vegetation is key, and ensuring that they have access to sort of this nutritionally balanced diet in the right appropriate amounts is really important. So next slide. Try it again. Okay, so we know that giraffe like to eat diverse types of woody vegetation in different ratios, but these plants aren't distributed evenly over space. In the savannas, there are often patches of woodland interspersed with patches of grassland. So these plants aren't distributed evenly in time either. These environments often experience dramatic changes between wet and dry seasons, which can impact the quality of the habitat. Like those in the more temperate environments, some of you guys experience winter and autumn where leaves fall off of trees. There's dry seasons where leaves fall off of trees in some of these tropical environments. So additionally, giraffe make movement decisions based on a lot of other factors too. How to avoid people and predators, how to avoid roads, and how to find other giraffe, just to name a few. So understanding how giraffe move around their environment is absolutely essential to figuring out the key habitat features that they need, and then figuring out ways to protect and access those resources. Next slide. To do this, we've developed a groundbreaking new study, which we've dubbed the Twiga Tracker Initiative. It's an ambitious conservation research program designed to develop a deeper understanding of giraffe spatial ecology and movement decisions across diverse habitat types throughout Africa. Over the past 5 years or so, a growing network of research partners, spearheaded by the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, has worked to design and deploy hundreds of GPS units on giraffe across Africa, from the hyper-arid deserts from northwest Namibia to the mesic savannas of northeast Uganda. We're working to identify critical habitat features for giraffe. Next slide. So how does this work? We've identified the need to track giraffe, but as you can imagine, giraffe's form makes it a little more difficult to use the conventional GPS tracking. You can't really fit a collar on a giraffe the same way you would for a zebra or a wildebeest, for instance. So we've worked with some developers to design specific units, which we call ASA units, which are about the size of a deck of cards. They're solar charged and they're mounted onto a giraffe ossicomb. These units collect the giraffe location at about hourly intervals, and they beam them up to your Iridium satellite network, and then beam them down to laptops or smartphones anywhere in the world. So we can track giraffe locations in the middle of the bush from our laptops in real time. Next one. Before we deploy these units, however, we want to make sure that we effectively think through every aspect of the study to maximize the utility. So we look at site-specific management priorities, working with our local partners to identify what they want to learn from these data on the ground. Site-specific research objectives, so working with local researchers to try to figure out new and interesting ways to use that local understanding of that particular system to learn something new about giraffe. And then we also incorporate it in this continental scale movement ecology study, dumping all the data into a single database and analyzing it all together so we can compare how giraffe are moving in these very different habitats. Next slide. So to date, we've deployed over 225 units. It's over 8 countries, all 4 species of giraffe. We've collected nearly 2 million points of giraffe data. And although this research is relatively new, these data are already telling us incredible things about how giraffe are navigating their environments. Next. Next slide. Whoop. Back one. So by overlaying these giraffe locations and movements on satellite imagery, we can identify hotspots, which represent places where giraffe are spending lots of their time. Here the hotspots are identified in red. These are the high quality resource areas that deserve special attention and special protection to ensure that giraffe have adequate resources. Equally importantly, we can identify the paths and habitats, the corridors that giraffe use to move between these hotspots and protect these corridors to make sure that giraffe can move around the landscape. Maintaining access to these corridors in seasonally changing environments is a hard thing to study, but these GPS units, where we can track multiple giraffe simultaneously, are giving us insights that we previously never imagined. Next slide. Whoop. Next. So additionally, we're working, next slide. James, I'm looking for a slide where there's a bunch of people standing in the back of a pickup truck looking at a giraffe. So additionally, we're working with partners to develop tools that allow rangers to access these locations in real time. We have specially developed apps that allow rangers to track locations from their smartphones, enabling them to target their patrols and anti-poaching efforts and their conservation activities to the locations where giraffe actually are. We can use these tools also with geofencing. So as a giraffe crosses a boundary that we've put on a map, just some digital map, and a giraffe walks across this imaginary boundary, it can send us alerts via WhatsApp in real time. So we can see when giraffe are, for instance, leaving protected areas, or when a giraffe on the border of Uganda crosses into South Sudan, and mobilize rangers to effectively take conservation action. And this has proven immensely valuable for giraffe